either live by the gun or you die by the sword.
Welcome to The Good, the Bad, and the Weird. I'm Nico.
And I'm Chris.
And Chris, I gotta put a little bit of a warning and disclaimer before this episode.
Fair.
9 out of 10 doctors say that this episode will be good for your health, but bad for education.
You're not wrong.
Well, actually, I am, because we're nerds and we deep dive into everything, so.
This is true. And I also don't have a drink for this one, because this week we watched Akira, and the only thing I could find that anyone willingly ingests is water, which you already have, and sad, gross sewage with a dead rat flowing in it. And I didn't want to drink that, so I have chocolate milk.
I mean, close in color.
Yeah, I guess so.
Yeah. So, we had decided on this movie early on because we realized that, or we remembered that it was set this year with the 2020 Tokyo Olympics mentioned.
The gods had spoken, it was meant to be.
And also it was released in the US on Christmas Day.
Yes. And so theoretically this is a Christmas movie.
That's debatable.
Yes. But we should preference this with the reason why that's important, because we saw the milestone for a lot of future movies ending their futureness this year, which was kind of scary.
Yeah, for example, the original Blade Runner, that took place last year.
Yeah.
Or not last year, last month.
Last month. So this movie came out in 1988. So it predicted not only, because you can calculate and know when the Olympics are, but it guessed that Tokyo would be holding the Olympics.
Yeah.
And it got it right.
It got it right. I mean, people say that, but it's just...
I mean, I think it's impressive that they guessed, threw a dart at a board, and were like, well, it's in Tokyo, we might as well have the Olympics going on. And they got it right, which is kind of cool, and thus we have to talk about it. Yeah,
and we'll get into that a little bit later, because it actually is kind of a plot point for the movie, or...
I mean...
Not a plot point,
it's a setting point.
Yes. There's a reason it's taking place there.
Yes,
so.
A clever reason, really.
Yes. So, this is probably one of my favorite movies.
I can see how it has influenced you throughout the years. Let's be real.
Yes. Favorite animated movies, and it's influential to world cinema in general.
Oh, very much so. And I think this movie, while it definitely has a huge cult following, it is not hard to find apparel for it, fans for it, theories behind it. I do think that this movie, despite being the pillar that it is, has not been as out there in recent years as maybe it could be.
I would say we've seen its influences, but its influences it's just not as well known as other sci-fi movies. Like one film it influenced, The Matrix.
Sure. Which,
of course, people are more familiar with.
And I can see why, but especially if you're into anime, this is one of the pillars, the cornerstone movies for the genre.
Yes.
And I think it's not been as well remembered as it could be, which is disappointing, but I get why.
Yes. Well, before we get into it, I actually have quite a few sources that I want to go over just to acknowledge that this is where I got a lot of this stuff.
Yes.
So I listened to interviews with Katsuhiro Otomo, the writer and director, not only writer of the movie, but writer of the manga that the movie's based off of.
Yes. And hi, Dad, manga is book. It's a cartoon book. I know you're going to get to this episode eventually.
Yeah, I've been sending gifts to my mom of this, and I found an awesome cosplay of Tetsuo, of the dude doing Tetsuo's arm.
Nice.
Yeah, I'll have to show it to you later. But anywho, other sources include 100 Manga Artists by Amano Masano and Giulio Wiedmann.
Yes. Sure, those names.
We will probably mispronunciate a lot of names in this.
There's a couple I'm going to purposely mispronunciate because I know it's going to make people angry.
Yes. So there were a few other articles. The Road to Akira and Its Legacy of Expression by Ryusuke Hikawa.
Yes.
Akira, a film too powerful for objectivity, which was an interview of the director by Ryusuke Hikawa.
Mm-hmm.
The effects of animation that made Akira shine, Ryusuke Hikawa.
Yep.
All these were from the pamphlet that came in the Steelbook edition.
Yes.
So, and then, of course, Wikipedia for a lot of the general information.
Same on the Wikipedia, my love and soul. But I also dug up a couple of old interviews where they talked about it.
Yeah. So, anywho, before we really get into it, I just want to give a very brief synopsis of what Akira is.
Yeah, because I do think that there's some confusion about it out there.
Mm-hmm. So, Akira is set, as we said, in 2019.
Yes.
It's set in a futuristic vision of Tokyo.
Yep.
Akira was originally released in 1988.
To the Japanese public.
To the Japanese public, the movie.
Yes.
And before we get into this again, I want to we're focusing only on the movie.
And specifically the first American dubbed version and then the Japanese original subbed version.
Yes. So with that as well, because I didn't want to have a review where we were comparing the book to the movie, because
you can't on this one.
No, and the director specifically noted that he treated them as separate entities to a point. They had commonalities, but he had to figure out how to wrap up a 2,000-page story in a 2-hour movie, which is extremely hard to do.
Well, and on top of that, the timelines for not only the story of Akira in both the book and the movie, but also the writing of the movie and the book are very convoluted and hard to follow. Nothing really existed first. Everything was cart before the horse, chicken influenced the egg sort of situation. There's some stuff that came first, but, they Ferris wheeled around each other quite a bit.
Well, Akira, the manga, was originally it was originally a series that I think started in 1982.
Yeah, that's the date I've got.
Yeah, so Akira started in 1982, being serialized.
Yes.
And well, for those who aren't familiar with it, in Japan, and they have a couple magazines here in the U.S., they'll put 1 or 2 chapters in a volume with a bunch of other stories and other series and release them monthly.
It's a lot how, the old Sherlock Holmes stuff used to be released, where it was more of a magazine publication than a full book that's released all in one go.
Mm-hmm. And so that's where Akira started. And so, back again, the brief synopsis of Akira.
Yes.
So it's set 2019, and it's in a almost dystopic...
I would call it dystopic. Things aren't going great.
Things aren't going great, but they never present it as being everything's going well.
No, it's the most believable dystopia I've seen so far.
So, from my base understanding, because the movie glosses over this a lot.
Yes, and I might be able to fill in some of the holes.
Okay. So, in 1988, in the movie, there's this explosion that destroys Tokyo.
Yes.
And 33 years later, Akira, or not Akira, we're introduced to New Tokyo.
Or Neo-Tokyo.
Neo-Tokyo.
Depending on which translation you got.
And dub. So, we're in a world where street punks are roaming the streets.
Biker gangs.
And most of this movie takes place in the slums outside of...
Yes. I think at one point they call it the old part of town, and this is the part that they couldn't fix up from the explosion.
Yeah, that's old Tokyo.
Yeah.
But where we're set, for the most part, is the slums of Neo-Tokyo.
Yes.
So, and in that, we have a group of biker gang. The main 2 characters are Kaneda and Tetsuo.
Yes.
And so the story, to sum it up, is about their relationship and Tetsuo's struggle for his acceptance or outperforming Kaneda.
Yeah. And I think this is one of the most interesting dystopias, because within the first couple frames of the movie, we are shown the massive explosion, which is originally shown and you're led to assume is a nuclear detonation.
Or some kind of new weapon.
Yeah. And everything's scaled really far out, which was really striking to me because I didn't remember that the first time I watched it.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's on a city scale up until the first few seconds, really, of the movie, which are really impactful because you're seeing this on a huge scale, and then we go forward and we scale back down to a single person scale.
And we're also informed that between this explosion and the film start and the main story taking place, there's been a Third World War.
Yeah.
And you're left to infer that it's triggered by that event. In the manga, as far as I'm aware, they explicitly say that this happened and it triggered World War III.
Yeah. The manga does explain it more so.
Mm-hmm.
But something that I think is, especially for an 80s manga, was a little bit different, was there's quite a lot of non-dialogued pages.
Mm-hmm.
So while the book does explain quite a bit more, and you are given a lot more scenes to digest and slowly go through, there's a lot in the story that is still left up for you to figure out.
Yes. And so before we really get a deep dive into Akira, I want to talk about cyberpunk. We've briefly mentioned it in our steampunk episode.
Ah, cyberpunk.
But
weird cousin.
Yes. So I want to talk about specifically the subgenre Japanese cyberpunk, because there is a distinct difference between the two.
Yes. And I would say, and I think a lot of people would say, that Akira is the pillar stone of Japanese cyberpunk.
Yes and no. So Japanese cyberpunk is generally divided between live action films and manga and anime.
Definitely.
So it's a genre that started off in the 80s as an underground film production style.
Yes.
It oftentimes does somewhat resemble Western cyberpunks with a low life, high tech, but there is a big difference in how they display the industrial metallic imagery, and on top of that, a lot of these movies have hard to follow or almost incomprehensible plots.
Yes.
And you're kind of left to...
Yeah. I think a good example of what a cyberpunk genre that's like really big, well streamed, Star Trek kind of falls into that same era and plot, only it's Western, and it's very clear to see where the differences are, where Akira takes, and a lot of the Japanese cyberpunks take a very grungy and weary look into technology and the future of it and how it might affect us. Especially in the 80s, a lot more of the Western view was shiny, silver, and a brand new, bold future. Mm-hmm.
And then we got movies like Blade Runner and 2001: A Space Odyssey that show a less than pretty version. Because honestly, cyberpunk, from my experience, is more, what's the term? Pessimistic towards the future.
Yeah, there's definitely more punk, less cyber.
Yes. So we can actually trace the start of Japanese cyberpunk back to 1982 with the film Burst City.
I haven't seen it, but I've seen the still images.
I watched it Sunday, and the plot is pretty incoherent, but...
Yeah, I mean, that's a staple, though.
The film is indicative of the punk style. You start to begin to see some of the cyber portion of it being introduced, but it's more of a punk rock movie.
Gotcha.
But by 1989, the genre itself was heavily defined by Tetsuo the Iron Man, which is one of my earlier films of Japanese cyberpunk that I'd seen. And it definitely established the style of the metallic deformation of humanity. And even then, before that, there was there are some other proto-movies that came out, like there's a Japanese cyberpunk film called Death Powder, which is considered probably the first cyberpunk movie, but not the one that defined it like Tetsuo the Iron Man did.
Sure.
And so some of the general themes and styles of this genre, and I apologize, this is going to be a bit of a history-heavy episode. there's a lot to unpack with this film.
Yeah, there really is.
So, generally, the style involves the protagonist going through monstrous metamorphoses in an industrial setting, and this way, the Japanese cyberpunk genre is tangential to body horror.
Yes.
And I've tried to get you guys to watch Japanese body horror before with Meatball Machine. I will get Brian to watch it.
Good luck on that. The other thing to note about that, especially for the animated versions of the cyberpunk genre, was we didn't really have anything like this in the Western world at the time. We had body horror. That's always been there. But the idea of an animated body horror to this level for an adult audience wasn't really a concept yet.
Well,
which unfortunately meant a lot of children watched Akira when they definitely shouldn't have.
I will say, even in Japan, I feel this movie was...
This one definitely brought it to another level, but thanks to having almost 3 decades worth of manga and anime being in their mainstream, this wasn't new to them.
No.
Like, the parents in Japan knew damn well what they were taking their kids to.
Oh, yeah. And so a couple other reoccurring elements to Japanese cyberpunk, which tie into Akira pretty closely. There's often this experimental film style with abstract visual sequences, and sometimes the visual sequences don't really add to the movie other than being some interesting visual elements.
Think like trippy graphics.
Yes. And then some of the reoccurring things are mutation, technology, dehumanization, repression, and sexual deviance.
And then there's one in there that gets swept under the rug, but I think Akira brought it more to the light, is the pinnacle in technology for a lot of especially the 80s Japanese cyberpunk, was smaller technology doesn't evolve. However, modes of transportation do. So that's often an easy way to spot an 80s cyberpunk.
Yes.
Is example, really fancy, cool motorcycles, but when they go to the bar, they still have a CD-style jukebox.
But at the same time, when Akira was made, CDs were becoming new.
Sure.
And so that was actually one of the director's ideas was, hey, what if in the future, instead of record players, they have CD jukeboxes?
Yeah. It's just the difference is, hey, let's enjoy the brand new fancy technology we have now for these little things, but oh boy, in the future, motorcycles, trains, planes, and giant robots are all definitely a thing.
And with early Japanese or early anime and manga Japanese cyberpunk, it was heavily influenced from what Wikipedia told me was Neuromancer by William Gibson, which
yes,
I know the name, but I haven't read it yet. And oftentimes the manga and anime have a similar vibe to movies like Blade Runner or
yeah, it's a very similar storytelling mechanisms.
And so I asked my buddy about this because there's a quote by William Gibson, who ended up becoming a fan of Japan and going to their frequenting the country.
What a lucky man.
And he had a quote that I thought was interesting. He said, modern Japan simply was cyberpunk. The Japanese themselves knew it and were delighted in it. I remember my first glimpse of Shibuya when one of the young Tokyo journalists who had taken me there, his face drenched with the light of thousand media suns, all that towering animated crawl of commercial information, and said, you see it, it's Blade Runner town. And it was. It so evidently was.
And I think that this specific style and genre, while not necessarily as literal as it used to be, I think still drives a lot of what we think of in modern Japan. They're still pushing the limits of technology, even for mundane things like toilets and showers, all the way to how they handle their big cities.
Well, that's something interesting, because I was talking to my buddy Joe about it, because he went to Tokyo earlier this year. And
fancy.
Oh yeah, I'm a bit jealous of him, but I asked him, like, what was it like? Because Tokyo's the biggest metropolitan in the world, and I was asking him, like, what is the chaos like there? And he said he said it's chaotic, but it's a very organized chaos.
Yes.
And unlike New York City, where New York City is very much just constant chaos all the time, it doesn't really feel like there's order to it.
Yeah, I can see what you mean there.
Yeah, and even in Akira, we do see that kind of element of there. Even though there's chaos going on, there is some kind of order to everything.
And I think it's that order that makes this dystopia one of the very few that, even though the movie left, and unfortunately had to leave out a lot of background information and world building from the manga, there is an unprecedented level of believability to this dystopia, whereas we've seen with other dystopia movies, especially ones that we think of as more classics, a good example that pops into my mind is like Mad Max.
Yeah.
You can't imagine a realistic and fruitful scenario of people living in that sort of world and having a normal life. Of any kind, whatever that means. Where in Akira, we do get glimpses of people having normal jobs, normal schools, normal lives. We're just not focused on them.
Yeah.
But they are introduced, so the world feels real.
Yeah, and honestly, that's one thing, going back and rewatching this, is that Akira, they said, it feels like a very modern city.
Yes, despite the destruction that it is surrounded by.
Yes. And so, with establishing the history and definition and themes of Japanese cyberpunk.
Hi, Charlie.
Hi, Charlie.
You still hungry?
No, he's not. So, with that history and themes, general cyberpunkiness established,
yes,
I kind of want to go into just a little brief history of how Akira went from the page to the screen.
Sure.
So, as we stated previously, Akira's initial run was in 1982.
Yep.
And it was debuted in Young Magazine. And originally, Otomo was doing shorts for them. He was doing a short series, all kind of having the similar style of a futuristic city, but everything kind of downtrodden and underground.
Yes.
And even before Akira, he has a short of this kid that has psychic powers.
Yes.
I don't know a whole lot about it. But they asked him, hey, you've been doing really well for us. Do you want to make a series? Which, that is a huge step for mangaka. Yes. As far as I'm aware, like, my knowledge of creating manga is a little bit limited to other series that actually talk about the creation.
Yeah, but especially in the 80s, getting someone to back you to make a whole series was a pretty big deal, especially since every single thing was hand done.
Yes. And so, even then, Otomo has stated that he has been inspired by other previous sci-fi series, as everything builds off of it. And some of that has leaked into his work. So, Akira is loosely based off a manga by Shotaro Kaneda. And it was called, I'm sorry, not Shotaro. That's the name of the character
there we go.
Tetsujin 28, which was his inspiration for Akira.
There's so many people who are named the same out of that one. In honor of.
Yeah, and so, like, 28, the kid who's kidnapped from the facility, he has a 28 tattooed on his hand.
Yeah. So
he has all these, like, little inspirations, and he wanted to... His initial idea was of a new chaotic Tokyo.
Yes.
And originally, the series was... He had a rough 2-page outline of what he wanted. It ended up becoming, like, a 2,000-page packet of what he wanted to do.
Yeah.
And so... he was also relatively influenced by American cinema too, like Bonnie and Clyde, Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and Easy Rider were the three that he said stuck out to him.
you can get a sense of, especially the Bonnie and Clyde one, with how he does his characters. He has a lot of fun creating punks.
Yeah, and well, that's one of the messages that he says stuck with him, is that these were movies about tired people and tired of their boring lives.
Yeah.
And so, he started writing manga almost out of necessity, because he was inspired when he was younger, but he needed to find something to fill his belly.
Yeah. Which,
honestly, from a lot of stories I've heard from directors, writers, actors, is that it's this desperation that creates inspiration and drives them. At least initially, until
you can, make rent.
Yes. And then we got method actors and people who put themselves in those kind of situations.
That's a different box of worms.
Yes. So, before he started making, after he started making Akira, he started helping with animation in other departments. I think he started with directing and helping out in the art department. And so there was a lot to that too as well. So Akira was a success before that.
Yes.
Before he started working on animation. And part of what's credited as Akira being so inspirational, you are getting annoying.
Thank you.
So, one of the interesting things about Akira is there is a shift in manga style and Japanese animation at this time.
Yes.
And it is tied directly to Akira.
Yes.
Before Akira, we had stuff like Astro Boy, which was a very Disney-esque style, rounded eyes.
It's cutesy.
Yes.
It's much more, I would call it, child-friendly.
Mm-hmm.
And then...
Otomo wanted to bring a sense of realism. He wanted smaller eyes. He wanted them to feel like everyday Japanese people instead of these caricatures.
And the main thing that distinguishes not only his style, but a good part of the 80s anime in general is a much more proportionally realistic characters. Even the ones that were drawn in the more soft or cutesy style would finally be drawn with legs that were at least somewhat realistic, or arms that weren't teeny tiny.
Or until Kingdom Hearts, when we got crazy shoes and hands.
What is with their feet? Why are their feet so big? But it's very easy to pick up a book in the library and kind of guess the 80s part of it based off of the art style, even if it's not one of the more realistic versions.
Yes.
And even from there, you can see how we have slowly adapted that throughout the years, because after the 80s, we got a little bit more cartoony with extra long legs, extra long arms, but more or less still had the small eyes and the realistic hair. And we've just kind of moved farther and farther away until now we're somewhere between Dragon Ball and, back to Astro Boy.
Where you can play the game of pick out the main character from the classroom scene.
Oh my goodness, my favorite game.
So, before we get into really the making of the movie, Otomo never really saw Akira as being animated until he was asked if he wanted to do it.
Which I can see why, especially from seeing his manga work, depending on how Western you want to get here.
Yeah.
Because he spends a lot of time and detail in backgrounds, which at the time, a lot of this was all hand done, which would have been quite the feat to do, and even though the story wasn't completed yet, his level of detail in his mind, I don't think would have been realistic until someone brought it up to him.
And that's one thing to take into account, is that this movie was released in 1988.
Yeah.
The series itself didn't end until, I think, 1990.
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. So Akira was not only was it groundbreaking in the manga scene, it changed Japanese animation.
It changed the world's version of animation, really.
So, with wanting to be more technical with the film, he wanted it to be more of a visual work and not just animated characters on a background, which was common of the time.
It was, think things like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Mm-hmm.
It's basic storytelling with some cute characters that you can remember.
The animated cells stand out from the backgrounds.
Yes. Or, if you did have painted backgrounds, they were done on a separate film and moved through the space sort of style.
Mm-hmm. And on top of that, from a storytelling viewpoint, I don't know the right phrase.
Sure.
Otomo wanted it to be more than a hero film, and not something that necessarily followed the hero's journey, but a visual piece.
And especially for animation, and while the Japanese storytelling lends itself a lot more, and this definitely wasn't the first one there. Once it was brought to the West, the idea of having in animation 3 main plots that were more or less loosely followed, as opposed to having one main character who we tightly watched and knew every thought and detail and emotion of.
Which we do have some precursors to that, like Rashomon by Akira Kurosawa. That's considered the first non-linear story.
Sure. But once it hit Western cinema, we mostly had things like Disney and I think Fievel Goes West.
Yeah.
We were limited.
We were. And so part of the reason I want to talk about the making of the movie beforehand, before we get into the movie, is because that's really how the movie was made. Yes. They used a technique called pre-scoring, in which dialogue is recorded before the film starts production, and the movement of the characters' lips are animated to match the dialogue, rather than the traditional method of the time of them animating and then having someone voice over and try and get it to match.
It's still not very common to do it this way.
No.
Now I think it's a little bit more common to have at least a rough sketch and animation for the actors to move along with. But they didn't choose to do that on this one.
Yeah. And well, he also thought that animation not syncing would be boring, honestly. And he thought lip syncing would be boring to begin with. So he worked...
Didn't get you.
Yeah. And so it is an interesting way to record stuff.
It is. And because of the level of detail in this movie, I think that this was the right decision for them. Mm-hmm. However, in a standard animated movie,
Well, in animation, we see more of a back and forth now, especially with them going to 3D animation, which it's much easier to animate once you have the character model set up.
Sure. And we even have examples of something kind of like this, where because it wasn't done as well and as thoroughly as this, we get a lot of really gold moments. The one that pops into my head the most is the animated Hobbit.
Oh, God.
Where they took true film of actors and then used it as a trace to animate over it, which is similar to how this process is thought through. However, instead of getting a incredibly realistic and immersive dialogue and detail to not just the people, but the entire experience, The Hobbit just kind of lends itself to really fun drinking games.
Yes, which I don't remember our last one, honestly.
It's okay, the third one's the worst.
Yes, well, our last drinking session for that.
I don't know if my liver can handle this.
No, God no. So, not only... audio-wise, or voice audio-wise, because there's a lot to get into about the music in a bit, too.
Oh, yeah.
So, not only did they try and advance the technology for recording, they also tried advancing the computer or not just computer animation, the animation in general.
Yeah, that includes both the hand and the computer.
Yes. So, this movie, for the most part, was hand-drawn. There are some 3D effects, but one of the most...
Good luck finding them, though.
Yeah, they blend so well together. Specifically, the one I know of is the patterns of, like, Akira and Tetsuo's patterns. Those were 3D.
Sure.
But that's a small part to it. But to get that pristine level of recording, they use a system that's called a quick action recorder.
Yes.
And it's a system that can digitize keyframes in between frames with a video camera and play them back at 24 frames per second. And they use this for motion and timing checks as well. And that's how they were able to correct and get such a smooth image. Because to give a little bit of information about animation, because I'm not super or inundated or know the full process behind animation, I do know that most animation you see is at 48 frames a second.
Mm-hmm.
And only in like Studio Ghibli films or more classic Disney movies, when you have more action and there's a more important scene,
mm-hmm.
they'll increase the frame rate to 24 frames a second. So what we're seeing for every second is 24 hand-drawn images.
Yes, and for a long time, Ghibli was thought of as kind of a world leader for that.
Mm-hmm.
And they still definitely are, mostly because of their emphasis on hand-drawn backgrounds that they've maintained for so long. But Akira kind of blew them out of the water.
Oh, yeah. And honestly, if I remember right, Akira came way before... Nope, I am wrong.
Nope.
Castle in the Sky came 2 years before Akira.
They did, and unfortunately... And this is... I'm glad you brought this up, because Castle in the Sky was released in the US as well. But it was edited down quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So when Akira hit theaters, and Castle in the Sky, for those of you who haven't watched it, it is more of a adult movie. It's not kid friendly, I would say,
mm-hmm.
but it's definitely more of a war-based movie than children happy fun times like My Neighbor Totoro.
Yes, and even then the visual style is more of a Western.
Yeah, it was definitely much cuter and softer than this one. And so when that one hit theaters, it had, I think, almost 20 minutes of the movie removed. And so Akira comes along to Western theaters with none of it removed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it defied a lot of the original expectations because it was, like, the predecessor to it was so different than it ended up being.
Yes. And so, as I mentioned earlier, I do want to get into the sound a little bit. Because, oh my god, I read so much nerd shit on just the sound making of Akira.
Yes, there's a lot.
Oh god, there is. And so, the sound of Akira was recorded by Geno Yamashiro Gumi, which is a musical group.
Yes.
The man who heads it is a brain scientist.
Uh-huh. Which, if you get around to watching Akira, will make a lot of sense.
Yes. And so, he has a very interesting take on music. Around this time, he was discovering what's called, if I remember right, the hypersonic effect, which is this idea that sounds below the human hearing range have a major impact on how we feel about something. And
if you're familiar with the horror genre, that gets brought up a lot.
Mm-hmm. And so, he did a lot of work. He drew heavily from full surround fields, Buddhist chants, Bulgarian polyphony, gamelan, jigog,
sure,
and other forms that use sound that extend beyond our range of perception in an effort to create a sound space like an earth mandala, encouraging the audience's spirit to take flight.
A pretty quote.
Yes.
For those of us with less good hearing, a good way to describe the soundtrack for this movie, because even if you don't have the full surround system, which I didn't when I watched it, despite my husband's best wishes.
And even then, we can't listen to it in the state he intends to.
Oh, no.
Until next year when the 4K DVD or the 4K version gets released, because
But now, even then, does any one of our friends have surround sound system set up?
Not right now.
Well, we'll get to that.
Yeah, but so that's one of the things too that he didn't like about the movie was that they couldn't get the sound he wanted. Even with movie theaters, he couldn't get the same...
No, not in the 80s.
Not even... Well,
not until recently.
And even then, barely today. We have to release it on a 4K DVD. the Blu-ray quality of sound is much better, but it's still not what he wanted.
Oh, yeah.
And even then, he talks about that, hey, there's all these devices that say, oh, we can make the sound like that. But he's like, no, it's not. We've tested them and nothing's hit.
To be honest with you, if you ever get a chance to hear the music score performed live, that's really as close as you're gonna get without going full on techno wizard here.
Yes.
However, if you are like me and still unable to appreciate that level of surround soundness, because let's be real, I hear everything in one direction at this point, the music in this movie is incredibly impactful in a way that we really haven't talked about yet. Most of the movies that we've talked about, while they might have had an important film score or even one that sticks in your head, the film score for Akira defines moments in a whole new way.
Well, and there's a lot to that too. So creating this album was extremely difficult. For one, this was recorded before the movie was actually started to be animated.
I feel like they did a lot of this backwards.
But at the same time, they created systems that helped improve the genre and just animation in general.
True.
But again, with making something new, there's a lot that comes from it, as we know, with making prototypes and...
Oh, yeah.
So, with this, he wanted to create a wide range of sounds, but he felt that Akira needed lush music to hold it together, because he had seen some of the keyframes, what they were planning to do with it. And he felt that... but he has this quote that I really like, if I can find it, because it's later in my notes, but he has this idea that music is critical to the human soul. And he feels that the human voice is the most spiritual object, whereas the synthesizer is the machine, and it's the coldest sound you can create. But he fuses the harmony between them. And on top of that, because he was writing everything together, he had to... Oh, here's the quote. He believes voice is considered the most spiritual instrument, the exact opposite of the synthesizer. But he did have to use a synthesizer for it. And they use a very specific type of sound playback. They used a synclavier, which is a digital audio system that can freely manipulate various effects of the sound on keyboard.
Yes.
And so how he wrote Akira is he wrote it up into segments that could be removed and stitched together. Kind of similar to how the people use synthesizers today, where they take an audio track, they record something, they cut it, and then they just copy and paste and edit where they want it to be.
Sure.
So it's a process similar to that. So, anywho, that is a lot of nerd stuff. I don't know a lot about the music. I do know that he liked the idea of using primal music and people and high tech to blend human conditions together, and that primal music in this, he used a 16 beat or 16 beat
beats per minute
or format. Just he played in 16ths. And so he felt that was the most primal sound, and that ancient music is the music of the future. So he creates a soundtrack that feels ancient but modern at the same time.
Yes.
And as we've seen in recent years, there's been a rise of folk music and paganistic bands.
A good way to describe his music is it sounds very traditional, but with an 80s techno vibe put on top of it for most of the movie. And then at key points in the movie where a character is either going through a physical change or a supernatural change, the voice part of the vocalist part comes in a choir-esque sort of way. And because there is a lack of that throughout the rest of the movie, it becomes incredibly impactful, and his choice to make the vocalist part a very harsh and almost purposefully out of tune with the rest of the world, it brings your attention fully around to something that otherwise would be a man standing in a field yelling like in Dragon Ball Z.
Yes. And, yeah, I mean, I honestly really like the soundtrack.
Oh, it's great.
I wish I could have been there to see your husband watch it, just because...
He was distracted. We need to rewatch it. He got his Christmas present early. He was focused.
Okay, that explains why he had so many questions at the Christmas party, then.
Yeah, no. He may or may not have only watched a couple minutes of it so that he could watch a video game that he got for Christmas early so he could play the video game, and he was watching a video of someone else play the video game that he had just played.
Yeah.
It's fine.
So, we've covered a lot about the making and the history of Japanese cyberpunk, Akira, and honestly, we have barely scratched the surface on this. There is so much information to this movie, and there's still so much more to go. I don't want to take up too much time with the history, because we could go on forever on that. So, now to actually get into the film itself.
Yes.
So, as you mentioned, we watched the original Japanese soundtrack, or the original Japanese voice acting in the American remake.
Yes.
Dubbing.
The first American remake. I know you watched the second one.
I watched all three.
I only watched the first one because I had seen the second outcome originally. That was the first one I ever watched. Mm-hmm. And I remember it having some moments.
There are some moments, but overall, it's one of the better dubbings that I've ever seen.
Oh, for sure. It's definitely not on the level of some of the ones that I've seen.
It's not like Ghibli where they're getting Hollywood actors to do it.
Oh, no. But I enjoy the first one more. Mm-hmm. I don't know. Just preference, I guess.
Yeah, for me, I do prefer I prefer reading subtitles and listening to it in its original language. That's how I prefer to watch a movie now. But rewatching the remake with the 1989 American voice acting it had a lot of nostalgia for me, because that's how I started anime and...
Well, and there's a lot of specific ways that things used to be translated all the time, especially for anime, that definitely dials the nostalgia level up to 10, even if you hadn't seen the movie before, or you've never seen the dubbed version before.
Yeah.
I think the subbed version, if you can read fast enough and also enjoy the fullness of the screen, I think that's probably my top way to watch this one, only because there is some wordplay and understanding halfway through the film that goes by so quickly that if you don't have a second to fully wrap your head around, you do miss a little bit. Mm-hmm. But with that said, this is one of the few ones where it is very difficult to keep up with not just the words, but also the intense amount of things moving and happening on screen at all times. Yes,
I would say if you're watching this movie first time and you're not familiar with Japanese, definitely watch it in English first and then watch it in Japanese.
There's a lot to take in all at once.
Yes. My favorite in the original American voice recording is Kaneda's character.
Oh, Kaneda.
Or
Canada.
How Tetsuo says Kanede.
Kanede?
Kanede.
I think they changed it every single time they said it. But you know what? So am I.
Yeah.
So it's fine.
No, and, I understand, anime and Japanese culture wasn't as influential or a big part in our society as it was back then.
No, and to be honest with you, the names that were picked for the characters in this movie, I wouldn't even call, standard choices for character names in a lot of films, even by Japanese standards.
Yeah,
Granted, they're not, the craziest name out of left field, but there were, at the time, quite a lot of staple names that if you knew your film was going to make it overseas, or you were hoping it would, you'd pick those because they're nice and safe.
Like Ryu or Sasuke.
Oh, Sasuke.
Yeah.
And Sakura. Everybody was named Sakura.
Yes, very simple names, and...
that even if you mispronounced, you could at least mispronounce it the same way every time, and get some type of consistency.
Well, and that's another thing, too, with Akira, is the name itself. for a long time, I always called it Akira.
I think a lot of people did.
Yes, and I do like to try and pronounce things more close to the language, and from my understanding, it's since I don't know the kanji, I don't know if it's a similar translation to like Godzilla, where it's actually Gojira.
It's hard to say.
Akira.
I don't read kanji either.
Yeah,
but from what I understand, it's meant to be more of a 3-syllable word than the 2-syllable that I often say. Mm-hmm. But oh well.
Yeah, regardless of how you pronounce it, everyone knows what you're talking about when you're talking about this movie.
Oh, for sure. There's no doubt. You might get teased, but at least you watched it.
Yeah, same thing with like in high school when you say manga, and then you get the first person to correct you and no, it's manga.
Or my dear mother, who one time said tortilla at a restaurant, and I have never let it go.
Oh, I actually have. We were at a Chinese restaurant. I'm sorry, Dad. I know you listen to this. Oh shoot. Well, we had a waitress, and we've come to understand that a lot of the names they give is an Americanized version, or it's a name they give themselves
to make things easier.
Yeah, exactly.
Sure.
And she was I forget what her name was, and she said it was. My dad's like, oh, so is it like this? And she says it's kind of similar. My dad mistook it as kaya similar.
Oh no!
And my mom and I knew exactly what she said, and she's like, no, she had a heavy accent, but she said kind of similar.
Oh, no.
And he repeats it again, and we're just sitting there laughing as he's trying to pay the bill, and she's getting mad at him.
Your Midwesterners were the worst at being able to understand foreign accents, and it's great sometimes. Oh, God. I love it.
Sorry, Dad. It's a great story, though.
Worth it.
So, anywho, this movie, like we said, it starts off with the start of everything.
Yes. It gives you a really fast but effective backstory to the whole world.
To the whole setup of why we're in Neo-Tokyo.
Yes.
The old Tokyo's been mostly destroyed.
Yep.
They've rebuilt, and they've become an even more powerful city.
To give you an idea of the level of destruction, one of the most impactful, quick clips that I see in this movie is there's a skyscraper with a shipping boat slammed through the top half of it. Mm-hmm. And, in your mind, you think to yourself, there's no way a natural force of nature picked up the entire shipping boat and put it through the upper stories of this high-rise.
I mean, there was the mile-high tsunami in Alaska.
Yeah. It's one of those things where it's this is a next-level force of nature that happened to the city. It didn't just flatten it, it destroyed it.
Mm-hmm. And so, from being established not only to the city, we get to see the bright, beautiful part of Tokyo early on.
Yes.
And then we quickly go to the bar where we meet
the
Canada.
Bar where nobody drinks anything.
Well...
Except for one guy. One guy does order a drink.
There are patrons, but Canada...
Sure.
is there, and he's... we also learned that people are finding other ways to stimulate themselves. Yes. There's a man who walks into the bar, and he asks for pills. He asks for peanuts.
Yes.
Which is a code name for some type of drug that's taken in pill form. And
to be honest with you, the movie never really says what the drug is or what it does.
You also don't see the good for health, bad for education that's on Kanede's jacket.
Yeah. And I kind of appreciate that they don't in-depth go into the actual drugs, some that come later that took inspiration from this, mm-hmm. Cowboy Bebop, where we do get to very in-depthly see the drug and what it does, which then leads you to make a decision on whether or not that's good or bad.
Yes.
This one, it's just drug.
Mm-hmm. And from this, we're also introduced to the lawless children of the Neo-Tokyo slums.
Yes.
And we're taught that Tetsuo is checking out Kanede's bike. And when he comes out of the bar, and they leave the bar because there's a rival gang called the Clowns that have been spotted.
Which this is one of the few points in the movie that kind of breaks for me just a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And I get that probably it's mostly due to what time period we're in, where clowns now to me means like scary people wearing masks in a cornfield, because I remember those days. And also Joker-esque.
Yeah.
And so this is the only other bike gang that's given a name. We know there's other ones, but this is the only one that we see and that we get a name for, and they are clowns.
Yeah. And even then, like, their aesthetic is interesting too, because they're called the Clowns because their gang leader paints his face like a clown, and they paint it on their helmets.
Yeah. And
so from this, we learn that Kaneda's bike is a hella cool bike.
So cool.
And he also mentions that he stole it.
Yes.
And that no one but him can handle this bike.
Yeah. He's made it clear that he stole it, but then he also made his own modifications to it. So later on we find out that there's some silly nonsense about it having to be above a certain amount of revs for it to even be on.
Yeah, and like he has to rev it up, and even when shifting gears it has to be at a certain...
It seems like a lot of ridiculous nonsense, but effective, I guess.
Yeah, but it feels believable at the same time, too.
Yeah.
Because this is a future bike. We don't know what it takes.
Yeah, exactly. For all we know, it takes Dragon Ball cards, like that one anime.
Yes. God. And honestly, this actually introduces probably my favorite song of the entire soundtrack when they meet the clowns, and you've got that deep, heavy, primal breathing, and then just the drums and stuff start picking up. That is, I love that kind of music. I love throat singing kind of stuff. That's just something I enjoy. But we're also introduced, like, we're deep involved in how beautiful Tokyo is, and also how violent the slums are, because they're fighting openly in the streets on the highways. Like,
they're wrecking other people's cars, and people are having to dive out of the way to not get hurt by these crazy kids. And I also think it's interesting that we've got a fairly diverse cast to keep track of in this movie. And with the exception of one character, we meet 3 of them all kind of in the same couple seconds. We meet Kaneda, we meet Tatsuo, and we meet his girlfriend, whose name completely escapes me.
We actually don't meet her for a while. We meet...
She's thrown on the back of the bike at some point.
That's later on in the movie.
Okay.
Yeah, that's quite a bit later. So there's a lot that happens in this movie. Again, a lot of stuff tends to blend together a little bit in like a first watch, or
for sure.
If you haven't seen it in a while, or like us, where we're trying to remember as much of it as we can.
Yeah, there's a lot that happens all at once. But
so, and during this bike scene, we're also interwoven with there's a rebellion going on.
Yes,
or not a rebellion, riots.
Yes, and to be more specific, they are riots that are not just like high school kids being upset. It's given more of the idea, much how current Hong Kong is going through, where it's normal people who are upset with the government of Neo-Tokyo, who are rising up. So, on top of having a big problem with gangs, they're also having governmental unrest.
Yep. And at this time, we're also introduced to the more sci-fi part of this of the movie, where you have a man who's running away from the government with a child in tow.
A very ugly child.
Mm-hmm. And he just happens to come across the rioters.
Yes.
And gets killed trying to help this child escape from we don't know what yet.
Yes.
And so at the same time, we learn that this child isn't what we think, because he freaks out and blows up the buildings around him, causing a beer display to fall.
Yes.
Which, talking about the animation for this movie, everyone in that scene has a different animation. They don't all react the same, which
is very different. Yeah.
Kudos to making that, because...
Well, and on top of that, because every single part of this movie was done with the mindset that it'd probably be animated in some way, even just to move the perspective of the camera.
Mm-hmm.
There's no old school Scooby-Doo look out for the slightly shaded cell block.
Yep.
Every single piece of it feels incredibly intentional.
It has that 3D feel without being a CGI movie.
Yes. It's very encapsulating.
Yes. And so, with that, we're still cutting between this kid running away, and then we cut back to the bike chase, where now they're gaining on the bikers, they're chasing them away from their turf, and they're fleeing to Old Tokyo.
They're doing biker gang shit.
Yes. And Tetsuo gets separated from the group because he's going after them, even though Kaneda is telling him not to.
Yes.
And in that time, Tetsuo almost hits the kid who's now on the highway.
Yes, we're not super clear on how he got to the highway. I saw some people thinking that he teleported there, and then others were like, it wasn't clear enough for me, he might have walked.
Yeah. And that's the thing, is that all this stuff feels like it's happening at the same time, but that other guy getting killed could have happened hours. Yeah. And so he's just trying to get away from the city.
A thing to note is when we say kid, this child is drawn like the oldest human on the planet.
Mm-hmm.
He is gray, he is wrinkly, he's on the verge of being a frog. So you... At no point are you under the disguise in this movie that the kids in the movie...
are normal.
Yeah.
It's not like Stranger Things where the only thing off about 11 is she has a marker and her head shaved. Yes.
So, just to be clear, like, this is definitely not a normal kid. Mm-hmm. This is an old man child.
Yes. And then in this, this is where the first major conflict happens between our protagonists and our antagonists.
Yes.
The government swoops in, takes the child, and takes Tetsuo.
Yes.
And Kaneda and his gang are arrested. And so I would say the three main characters, or the three main groups, are Tetsuo,
mm-hmm.
Tetsuo's group, the rebellion, and the government.
Sure.
Specifically in the rebellion, Tetsuo's girlfriend, whatever her name was.
Yeah, that girl.
Yeah, she
started with a K, I think. Not sure.
No, that was no, that's Tetsuo's. I'm thinking Kaneda's girlfriend, the one in the rebellion.
Oh, Kai? Kay?
No.
I don't know.
Yeah, whatever her name is.
Unimportantly named person.
So, that's their first brush. This is where all three converge. Because we go from this to the children being
creepy as all get out.
Yeah.
They're creepy kids.
Yeah.
For all powerful beings, like, I feel like we could have done better here.
Mm-hmm.
And not saying that, like, the animation or the story choices were bad, just that the kids themselves are presented in the most stereotypical child way possible of their own choosing.
Mm-hmm. And so, with this, there's actually a kind of funny scene where Kaneda is being interrogated by the government or the police force.
Yes.
And he's got this big smiling grin across his face. His hair is all down. He's looking as best as he can. And we get a glimpse of his ID card, and he's just like... His
driver's license looks so dumb.
Very Naruto Rebellion-esque.
Very much a shit-eat grin sort of mindset here.
And so they quickly realize, okay, they're just a bunch of stupid high school punks.
Yes.
And on letting them go, some dude pulls out a grenade and is like,
long live the rebellion or some nonsense like that.
And then the grenade's a dud.
Well.
Yes and no. And so this is where, because in the interrogation, Kaneda sees a beautiful girl.
Beautiful girl that he does not know.
And then he finds her in the crowd and says, hey, she's one of us. Can she come too? And they're like, just get out of here. We're done with you.
Yes.
And so that's how we start. this is where everything starts to really intermingle.
Yes.
And so, with that, we also start to see we cut to see what's happening with Tetsuo.
Poor Tetsuo has one hell of a journey.
Oh,
Poor guy. He's not having a good time.
You do feel sorry for him, because we already know at this point, he's kind of like the younger brother to...
Yes.
Kaneda.
And while Kaneda definitely seems to thrive in the chaotic world of Neo Tokyo, you kind of get the sense that he doesn't. It feels like maybe he would have done better in a nice, stable house.
Yeah.
Where Kaneda is chaos.
Yeah, he's just who he is. And so, with this, we're also understanding... And very quickly after the test, we understand that something's going on with Tetsuo. Something's changing. Because he escapes. He kills some guards.
Yes.
We see that now, okay, he's starting to manifest psychic powers.
Yes.
We don't know why, though, but...
Quick side note. The guards in this hospital that is also kind of a prison are the worst guards of all time. Lock the door.
I think in the original recording, one of them's voiced by the guy who does Spike and Cowboy Bebop. Yeah, just that unique voice.
Yes, very much so. But he manages to escape, decides that he's going to go find his girlfriend so that they can run away from Neo Tokyo because he's done with this shit. He wants out. He doesn't want to be here anymore. He's going to go start a new life somewhere else.
Yes. And so... I wrote this. Anywho, so Tetsuo escapes, meets up with his girlfriend, and this is where the scene where we find out what you were thinking is. He and Kairi steal Kaneda's bike.
Yes.
And while he's on his bike, he's mistaken for Tetsuo, and the clowns attack.
Yes.
And it's a pretty intense scene, honestly.
It is an adult scene for sure.
Mm-hmm. And probably one of the things that really establishes this more as a kid's movie, because, okay, yeah, it's a little violent in the beginning, but these clowns are beating the shit out of his girlfriend.
Yep.
They're probably going to rape her because they rip off her shirt.
Yes. And
they've got him pinned down, but luckily Kaneda comes in and saves the day.
Mostly saves his bike because they were going to torch the bike.
Yes. But at the same time, I feel he at this point he is more worried about Tetsuo.
I think, yes, he is more worried about Tetsuo, but the way the scene is shot and written, from his point of view, you could see how he would mistakenly think that he's coming to save his own bike.
Yeah. Because
they wait until that last possible moment to give the, final, this is the end card, as opposed to beating him up or his girlfriend up. The last final, we got you is we're going to torch your friend's bike. Yes.
And so, with this, we also begin to understand where Tetsuo is on a mental scale.
He's not doing good.
No.
Guy should go see somebody about that.
After beating up one of the clowns, we know he has anger management. He almost kills this guy, and then he's like, you know what, I'm just going to do whatever I want. And as he starts walking off, he has this trippy psychedelic collapse where he falls. Well, I wouldn't say psychedelic. It's a trippy collapse where he falls down. The ground and the pipework underneath him starts crumbling out. Then it cuts back to him. His guts fall out.
He's having a bad trip.
And then it cuts to what he actually is, and none of this has happened. He's trying to shove his guts back in.
Yes.
And at this point, we also learn that he's emitting some sort of frequency that he's being tracked on.
There's a side kind of unused character whose only real purpose in the story is to explain on what level the psychic power is being a problem. And so this doctor is noticing that Tetsuo not only has psychic abilities, but that his psychic abilities are lining up and matching
something called Akira.
Yeah. Which, from what we are at this point told, is like a god. That's all we really know, is that it's next level shit.
We don't even fully know. We have an Akira cult going on.
I think, especially if you had watched this with the amount that had been released, which wasn't possible because it wasn't released in the US until 12 years after the movie was released.
No, it was released in 89.
The book was released in Japan in 89. I don't think the manga was translated until later.
Yeah. You're talking about the manga. Sorry.
Yeah.
I thought you were talking about the first dubbing.
No.
Yeah.
No. The written work, which would have potentially explained who some of these background side characters were a little better, like the Doctor and the cult leader, who are given a much bigger role in the manga. So if you had somehow managed to either be able to read Japanese or,
and get
time traveler.
And get the serialization, because the only way we really got it was compiled into 6 volumes.
Oh, yeah. No, so it would have been more clear of who this doctor was, because at that point I think you would have understood that this guy was supposed to be like the world-leading research on this. He's Japan's secret weapon for this. And then you would have also understood that the cult leader was used to work in that department and knew about the secrets fancy children.
Yep. And then so from here, the gang's let go.
Yep.
Tetsuo is recaptured. Kaneda and the
back
gang
in his really horribly locked hospital prison room.
Yep.
They really should lock some doors and windows in that place. Put some bars up.
Well, I
don't know, bulletproof glass or something.
Something. But at the same time, we know Tetsuo's power is something special.
It is.
And so with this, Kaneda and his gang return to boring their girlfriends, and
we're also given a glimpse of what their idea of normal is, which I could see how some people would consider like excess background story, but I appreciate it because we're given a glimpse of what their high school is like.
Yeah.
And their high school is not great. The statue out front is horribly
graffiti. The walls are
dirty. Everything's dirty, and their principal's version of discipline is to have the gym leader smack them across the head for getting arrested.
For a second there, I thought when you said gym leader, you meant Pokemon. I
mean, kind of at this point. Why not?
And this all happens right before Tetsuo steals the bike.
Yeah.
Tetsuo steals the bike. So we're back. We're in the nighttime of Tokyo.
Yes.
And a bomb goes off. The terrorists are back at it again. And this is when Kaneda really gets involved with his love interest.
Yeah, his love interest being the key word here.
Yes. It's a very one-sided.
Oh, it's horribly one-sided. Poor guy. But
Kay is her name.
Haha.
So he kind of follows her and ends up getting imprisoned.
Yeah, poor guy follows a cute lady to the point where he is captured by the rebellion and questioned for being a spy.
And they're just about to off him when he's like, yeah, no, the guy who was caught earlier, I know him.
He's my best friend.
And also, we're given more into what the children are. There's one girl, she's encased in a dome, and she has a dream.
Yes. She seems to be the one who is the kindest soul out of the group. There's 3 children in total. Or at least 3 original children in total.
3 that we see, because remember, they're numbered like 28.
Oh yeah, no, these are the 3 that we see. And each child, has a different level of mobility, which is an interesting concept, but also they have starkly different personalities, which they use to create one personality, which is the children.
And even then, different powers. One can see the future, one can read minds and communicate telepathically. The other has a similar power to Tetsuo. He can create force fields and just blow shit up. So, also at the same time, we're informed that we're given a prophecy by her. And she's telling the leader of the government, or the leader of the army, that if they let Kaneda go, Akira will be released. And this is when we really start to understand what Akira is. From this, we go to... the leader of the government goes to the Tokyo Olympic Stadium that they're building.
Yes.
And this is where this becomes an important element of the movie.
Because if you're gonna hide a giant secret base inside the biggest metropolis in the world, where are you gonna put it?
Put it in the new building that they're doing.
For the Olympics.
And this is where we find out that they're hiding Akira.
Yes.
And when we cut to it, we learn that there's a bunch of jars there. Which I and your husband, which this is a moment your husband forgot. Or we had questions on.
Sure.
And then I looked it up today because it was about the kelvins that they were saying it was kept at. It was like 128 kelvins.
Yeah. And
no, I looked it up. That's like negative 400 and something degrees.
Yeah.
It's hella cold there.
Yeah. I will say this, that anime and manga specifically have a horrible reputation of just picking a big number.
Mm-hmm.
So does this number have any real significance other than just being hella cold? I don't think so. Not for this time.
Yeah, I don't know either. But anywho, so from this, we're exposed to what Akira is. It's a bunch of jars.
Yes.
We're not 100% sure what the jars hold.
No. But we got some jars. They're in the icebox and they're under the stadium.
Mm-hmm. And so from this, the terrorists take offensive.
Yes.
They're kind of caught and they're starting to break in, all while Tetsuo is being attacked by the other psychic child. I wouldn't say being attacked. He's being intimidated.
He is being intimidated
in the most childish way.
And in the most, like, nightmare-inducing way possible.
Mm-hmm.
So instead of showing up and beating him up like grown adults, they choose to project giant teddy bears and bunnies in his room that are an amalgamation of all of the objects around him.
Bleeding milk.
Yeah, the milk part's weird. I don't get the milk part. It's gross. And it is... Everything in that scene feels alive and fluid in the most disgusting way possible.
And I think, if I remember right, Otomo originally wanted to animate it and make them just grow in size, but then he was watching something, and they did that. And he's like, well, that's actually kind of boring. I want to do something different instead. And
this is the first spot in the movie where we're truly given that sort of visual, which has kind of become a staple to the film and the identity of Akira, is this pulled together, living organic out of bits of the floor tile and the water and the pipes and the hosing, all disgustingly amalgamated together to create a much bigger, still disgusting, but cohesive thing, like a bunny or a teddy bear.
Yeah, and so one thing we forgot...
How does he defeat the giant bunny and teddy bear?
He freaks out.
He steps on a piece of glass and the kids freak out from blood.
Yep. Yeah, well, and so another thing that we're kind of glossed over is Tetsuo is starting to hear the name Akira. Yeah, it's echoing through him.
Yeah, he's starting to, depending on how you choose to look at this film, he's either starting to lose it and his powers are telling him, or the children are implanting this into his head.
Yeah, well, not even that, because it's when he's being tested that he first hears the name.
Sure. There's no doubt that one of the children, specifically the girl, is putting thoughts into his head. But the way that Akira is written, which is kind of nice, is that there's so much room for interpretation because nothing's directly told to you most of the time, that it is kind of fun to wonder if whether or not some of this is the universe impacting him.
Or is it Akira? Because we're told Akira's energy is everywhere.
Yeah, so maybe this is Akira himself attempting to speak to Tetsuo.
And so, at this point, the terroristic group some of them are getting killed. They're trying to escape now.
More of them are getting killed, because they were definitely getting mowed down earlier.
And so, I think the only ones who actually do escape are Canada and Kay.
In the most disgusting sewer scene ever.
Yes. Ugh.
So, especially growing up with Western animation, sewers are... They've got like one live rat in them, but for the most part they don't look like they're that bad. This is the most disgusting sewer to ever be animated, I'm pretty sure. Like, there is a rat that floats to the surface while one of the characters' mouth is open and in the water, and it has maggots crawling all over it. This rat is not alive, it is not cute, it has been dead for a very long time, and this child is in the water with his mouth open.
Yeah.
You can practically smell it.
And so, with that, Kaneda and Kei, they're
going on a rescue mission.
Yes, they crash into the nursery.
Yes.
And this is where we get their reunion, and we understand that Kaneda now, not Kaneda.
Tetsuo.
Yeah, Tetsuo now has an animosity towards him. He's like, you don't have to protect me anymore. If I want, I'll protect you. He's realized that he has some power inside him.
Yes. And this is one of the most interesting points, because I think this part right here defines the powers that are in Akira. These kids and Tetsuo are given godlike powers, but they are not turned into gods. They are just themselves, but more powerful. And so instead of playing superhero like Batman or Superman do in the Western world, they are just as bitter and upset as they already were. But instead of having to suppress it, he's now able, or in his eyes, able to act on his anger.
Mm-hmm. Yes, youth in revolt.
Oh, very much so.
And so, at this time, through one of the children, we learn that, or Tetsuo learns that Akira is under the stadium.
He's gonna go get him.
And so he rushes out there because no one can stop him at this point.
He learns he can fly on accident.
Yes. And Kaneda and Kei are captured again.
You know, they're doing a real good job at that.
To be fair...
This is the only people in the show that get captured.
Tetsuo does.
Tetsuo also just leaves his room on multiple occasions, though.
Yeah. To be fair, Kaneda is a hot-headed, stupid kid. He
is always a hot-headed, stupid kid, which I appreciate. He never suddenly gets good spy instincts.
Part of the reason he's in this is because he's chasing Tail.
The entire reason he is in this is because he's chasing Tail.
And so, after this, they're allowed to escape by the psychic children.
Yeah, the kids give them permission because mostly, I think, the girl psychic child senses that they will be useful to them, and then the able-bodied boy child remembers them from the bridge.
Yes. And also, we now know that Tetsuo is heading towards the stadium.
Gotta go get him, too.
We're learning also that the upper society's not doing so well either.
No.
The government is fighting with the military, and as they're about to arrest the general... Or no, he's a colonel. That's what his position. Yeah, they call him a colonel.
They call him a colonel, but the way that the story's written is they kind of give the impression that, at least in this district, he is the head military body, and he is supposed to be separate from the governmental body, but he has decided that their decisions are stupid, and he will not follow them anymore.
And he begins a coup d'etat.
A very effective coup d'etat as well. Mm-hmm. Like, this is arguably one of the quickest and easiest coup d'etats in anime.
Yeah, he's wiping out government officials left and right.
And all of for the most part, most of their soldiers are like, yeah, sounds great, let's go. Mm-hmm. Like, he doesn't have any problem. Which I think speaks to the true unrest that this world and Neo-Tokyo is having. Mm-hmm. Because if it had been done any other way, where everyone was fighting, it would have given more of an impression of some level of stability within the city. Mm-hmm. And since almost everyone but the government officials themselves decide, nah, I'm tired of it, I think that even lends more to this idea of unrest and corruption.
Yes. And so, with this, we're also given more information, or a little bit more information on what's happening. The revolts are still happening, and the protesters mistake Tetsuo as Akira.
But in their defense, he is a very arguably good interpretation of what Akira should look like.
Yeah, he freaking stops a tank round and then crushes the tank.
And if all you know about and it's not necessarily directly implied during the movie, but in the book a little bit more so, all they really know about Akira was that it was a child, and that it had incredible psychic powers and was able to end the earth. And
from what I remember from an interview is that more so Akira was kind of this amorphous amalgous object that no one fully knew what it was.
Yes, and so because A, he now has Dragon Ball hair, which I greatly appreciate. I love it very much. He's stopping military rounds with his mind and then crushing them. Mm-hmm. He's also clearly on a power trip and gone a little crazy.
Yep.
And he then puts a cape on himself.
A dope cape.
A pretty dope cape for one he just found on the ground. I understand why the crazy rebellion people decided that this was Akira.
Yep. And then on his way to the stadium, he destroys a bridge because the government's starting to shoot at him.
Yeah.
And we are starting to learn that his powers are limited. He can't just stop these pulse rifles. They curve around him and start hitting the protesters and cutting the bridge apart.
True, but at the same time, you are left wondering if he just doesn't care enough to protect them.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And then he invades the facility where Akira's at, and we learn...
destroys months of construction work!
Yes, as all action movies must.
I hope that the construction industry in this world is paid very well.
And so we finally get our first view of what Akira is. Akira is just bits and pieces of a human being.
Floating in some formaldehyde.
Well, they're more in like an acrylic casing of some kind. Yes. And then they're suspended in this liquid encased and in a sub-zero facility.
The reason I'm choosing formaldehyde is A, nostalgia level science fiction, because everything is formaldehyde, but also because formaldehyde has a very distinct smell for those of you lucky enough to never have gotten to smell things out of a jar. And even with the jar lid closed, it has a distinct smell.
It gets everywhere.
And so I really like the concept of him raising this thing up out of the ground, popping this open, and the first thing that hits him is the smell of formaldehyde.
Mm-hmm. Well, he does... Yeah, I guess so.
It's just a personal preference.
Yeah. And so, with this, we also have the first real conflict between Tetsuo and Kaneda.
Yes, Kaneda has... And they never tell you in the movie where, but he has gotten himself a cannon rifle thing.
Which...
Laser cannon?
Your husband had questions on where that even came from, and the government was using it.
The government was using it. They don't show him getting it, which I kind of like, because it, for all we know, he just picked it up off the ground, because the government doesn't seem to be on top of their shit right now.
Yeah, and as far as we know, there's only one bridge connecting to Old Tokyo.
I do know we get an aerial view, but let's be real, we don't really know how big New Tokyo is, so, the other bridges, if there are any, could be really freaking far away.
And this is a really cool fight scene, too, because now we're also introduced that the government has cool space beam weapons.
They have a satellite orbiting the Earth that can shoot a laser.
Yeah.
And kill things.
And this is one of the coolest fight scenes.
I would also say that this is where the future part of the story really starts to hit home. Because while his bike is cool and futuristic, you're never really given the sense that it's that futuristic. It's just kind of a weird shape. Once we start fighting with lasers, that's when it starts to feel future.
Yes. He's riding around.
He's on his weird motorcycle with the laser cannon gun thing. And one of the parts that I like most, because this is how well thought through this is, the laser cannon has a battery that it has to be connected to, and he runs out of battery. He doesn't run out of shots, he runs out of battery and has to go get a new one.
And it's very much like Neon Genesis Evangelion, where they have the umbilical cord and they have to be connected to it.
Yeah. And because they bothered to think of the fact that this thing needs a battery, it's going to run out of juice at some point. It also lends a natural break in the fighting, so that way we can change venues again.
Change venue? Well, because that's when he gets attacked by the satellite, and then he flies up.
And he ain't not about that life.
Yeah. And this is when Tetsuo is damaged. In that laser beam, it shoots off his arm.
Granted, he only loses an arm from being shot from space with a giant laser, which I'm sure was meant to take out, a lot more than just one kid. But, still got hurt.
Yeah.
The part that I think is a nice detail, if you choose to ignore the fact that now he's bleeding from his arm and in space, how does he breathe? It's cold up there, that whole thing, is that the sound becomes incredibly muted and for the most part off while he's in space.
Well,
which is a fun dynamic.
Which is great because that's actually how space is. Space is quiet. There's nothing.
Yeah.
And that's another thing about this movie that was commented on, is that it's a rather quiet action movie.
Yeah, it's not the constant loud that we're used to.
Yeah,
it definitely has its loud points, but there's a lot of quiet for fight scenes.
And even then, there's no music. It's just...
There is some choir singing at a couple parts, but again, it's choir singing as opposed to again, think Mad Max heavy metal guitar.
And it's more the in-between moments. It's not the big action fight scenes. Those are quiet. And so, from this attack, we move on to Tetsuo running away. Kaneda's
doing whatever Kaneda's doing.
Yeah.
Getting a new battery, I think.
Yeah, he's trying to find a way to defeat Tetsuo. And in this time, Tetsuo goes to the bar, asks for pills.
Because, and it's hinted at throughout a good portion of the movie, but up until this point, it's not brought so much to our forefront, is that while he was in the hospital, he was being given pills to help control his psychic powers.
Yes.
And he's now run out.
Yeah, and so now his power is...
It's taking over.
Yeah. And so, in that, he actually kills one of his friends who goes to the bar to see how everything's going.
I mean, granted, he was being hella creepy goblin-y in the corner, so, it wasn't a matter of, he killed him out of rage. At this point, it's made very clear Tetsuo is out of his mind.
Yeah, he's lost it.
He's on another level of tripping.
Yeah, he's drunk with power.
Very much so, and now on drugs.
Mm-hmm.
Are these the drugs that he was being given in hospital? Probably not.
Nope. And so, now we know he's gone to the Olympic Stadium. He's...
made a throne for himself.
Which
I think is hilarious, because... And I only think it's hilarious because we're not shown him actually creating the throne. It's just there.
I think the throne's for the Olympics.
It is, but the way it's placed and the way he uses it kind of gives off the vibe that, there is an Olympic king, and he has taken his throne.
I kind of like that, though.
I mean, that'd be cool. I don't know who gets to be Olympic king, though.
President of the country who gets the most medals?
Nope, let's not do that.
I mean, it's just an honorary title.
How about the Queen of England? She seems nice.
Yeah.
How about she gets the special seat?
Maybe. But, anywho, so, also this time, Canada's gotten his gun charged up through his motorcycle.
Found a new battery / made another battery.
He charged it with the motorcycles.
Which he then caught his friend's motorcycle on fire doing, which... I liked the dynamic because it shows that just because the world is ending, these kids have not changed. Mm-hmm. There's not this dramatic arc in this movie like we're used to talking about.
No.
This kid's bike catches fire, and he is still furious about his bike because that's all he really cares about.
Yeah. One thing we did forget to mention at this point, after his arm being blasted off, he has taken debris from around him and fashioned a cyborg arm.
He now has a cyborg arm, which... I mean, it seems fine.
Yeah.
It's functioning, at least.
It's functioning for now. And while he's on his throne, Kay has followed him.
Yes. His dear beloved girlfriend, and arguably the only person in the world he truly loves.
Yes. And we're learning that his power is really starting to run out of control.
He's also probably off the drugs at this point. He seems back to himself when he's talking to her, whereas earlier we were Goblin Man.
Yes. His arm has started to mutate. It started to infuse into the chair.
It's not looking good.
The government man shows up and tells him, hey, we need to get you back. Or he tells him to go... Tetsuo tells the guy to go get him drugs so he can be fine again.
Yes.
And at this time, the guy angers him, and his arm really mutates. It becomes this amalgamous blob of flesh and metal and
concrete bits.
And this is where we really start to see how tangential and how close to body horror these movies can get.
Yeah, definitely. Because the rest of it, while graphic, I wouldn't necessarily count as body horror.
No.
But from this scene up until pretty much the end of the movie, is all got that nasty, squishy, fleshy feeling.
My favorite. And so this is where stuff really loses its shit. Where it's hard to describe action movies without going every single moment, just because this is
there's a lot going on all at once in this one.
Canada shows up to save Japan.
Or something. I don't really know if he's got a goal.
Yeah, but so he comes up, guns charged, confronts him,
blazing away on his motorcycle.
And while he's trying to stop him, while Tetsuo's trying to stop Kaneda, we get this, he completely loses his power to the point where he loses his human form. He's blobbed off into craziness,
and he accidentally traps his girlfriend. And it's made blatantly clear that is not what he wanted. He's begging for help from Kaneda to get back. He doesn't like it. He doesn't want to be like this anymore. And he accidentally crushes his girlfriend to death.
Yep.
And at that point, his Amogus form takes the shape of a giant baby. Which is weird, but if you stop to think about it, makes sense.
Yeah, with the whole meaning of everything, his powers unleashed. I don't even know. It has baby features, I would say, because of the big eyes and big head.
If you remember how the baby is drawn, the giant baby is drawn in Studio Ghibli's Spirited Away. They are similarly shaped.
Yes.
And so that's why I choose to think it as a baby, because I think that there's probably some like standard baby drawing-esque things in Japan that we don't have over here that leads it to be more baby than just giant-headed man.
Okay. Yeah, I can see that.
The other reason I say baby is because of how he is acting and how he feels at this point. He feels completely helpless. He feels
great remorse for what he's done.
Yes.
Well, I wouldn't say remorse. He's regretful.
He's regretful, and he is incredibly fearful.
And at this point, everyone is completely useless of what's going to happen. We now have an inkling of what happened 33 years ago.
Yes. And at this point, he has also accidentally captured his arguably only other friend in the world, Kaneda, is also stuck in there. And while I don't think Kaneda ever truly sees the girlfriend's death, I think he definitely knows.
Yeah.
So he's worried about being crushed to death, while Tatsuo is also panicking over he's just killed his girlfriend on accident, now he's about to kill his best friend on accident, and
his body's not listening to him.
There's nothing he can do to stop it, but he gets to watch all of it.
Yes. And in this climax, they're still all helpless. Like, he gets out and he gets away as he starts to almost so the three toddlers show up at some point.
The eldest toddlers of them all.
And they're almost praying to Akira.
It's kind of an odd scene only because we haven't really seen them working together before. And so I think their positioning was meant to more so represent them focused. But especially from a Western culture that's used to sitting eyes closed, hands together to focus on prayer, it definitely showed off a little bit more as praying.
Yeah.
Is it praying? I don't know. It's kind of for interpretation. Might be.
Yeah. And so with that, the jars break. The acrylic holding Akira apart is...
The smell of formaldehyde was everywhere.
And we get a big flash of light, and it starts consuming the city, crushing everything as it comes out.
Yes, we've created a space within the universe that is its own space for Akira to be contained.
Yep. And while most of them are almost out, as the light's encompassing everything, Tetsuo is being pulled in, and he's starting to get his form back, and he's calling out for Kaneda to save him.
Still terrified.
Oh, yeah.
Having the worst day of his life, really.
And the children are trying to stop him from going into the light.
They explain that once he's in, he'll never be able to come back. Kaneda doesn't seem to care.
Jumps right in, and...
No questions.
We get a dream sequence of their past.
Yes, which is an interesting way to do it.
I really liked it, because now all this built-up frustration we've seen between these two characters is washed away by what actually brought them together in the first place.
Yes. So we're given his memories of growing up poor, growing up no parents, growing up on the streets, his first joys, so him riding the bike with his best friends, them starting the gang, and then we're also introduced to Akira.
Yeah.
And Akira's past.
Which, I would say for flashbacks, that is probably one of the better flashbacks I've seen, because normally they'll explain everything right up front, and it's
a lot of detaily bits, usually.
Yeah, it leaves nothing to imagination of like what's happening, and then they explain it, and even then, you still don't know everything. It just gives you glimpses.
You a hint, yeah. So it gives you a hint that Akira was at one point, as was all of the other old people children, normal kids who the government decided had potential to be psychic.
Psychic weapons, I think, is what they were probably looking for.
Oh, I'm sure that's what they were wanting, but that's not what the kids signed up for.
Mm-hmm.
And so we're given a brief understanding that while these kids were being trained to be psychics, they weren't necessarily unhappy.
Yeah.
They all enjoyed each other. They had a good time.
They understood that they needed to be there.
Yeah, and at no point does it look like they're being mistreated in their memories. So the now four special kids of old time, but also not, we understand that they are incredibly close friends, just how Tatsuo and Kaneda are. And now Tatsuo gets to be best friends with the old people as well.
Yep. And so, to save Kaneda, who they refer to, I think in one of the dubs as the Innocent.
Yeah, because when he jumps in, they argue amongst themselves that this isn't his fault. He just was here on accident.
Yeah.
He doesn't deserve whatever's coming next.
But the three of us together, we can reverse this, but we won't be able to come back either. And that's an interesting thing too, because as far powerful as Akira is, we learn that he is not all powerful.
No.
That with enough force, he can be suppressed. And of course they do so. The ball of light starts to collapse in on itself. And
this is the point where the Doctor, who for the most part had been forgotten up until this point, comments that this is the birth of a new universe. He's watching a new Big Bang happen.
Yes. And that's when we're actually told what happened 33 years ago, is that a new universe was created. And it's kind of an interesting concept because it starts to deal with parallel universes.
Yes.
And just like this creation of like, okay, they've transported themselves to a new world.
Yes.
And we're just kind of left open to what is actually going to happen to the elder children and Tetsuo.
Yeah. And at this point, the lab that held the Doctor collapses, crushing him, which I think implies that the knowledge that this man, who was top secret, only the government and the colonel knew about him. Arguably everyone in the government's dead, and potentially the colonel too. We don't really know what happens to him. And even if he does make it, who's gonna listen to him? Does he even understand what's going on to the fullest? So arguably all of the research and understanding and knowledge of Akira and the power that these kids have has effectively been destroyed.
And it's kind of the punishment for this group of people trying to become gods, almost.
Yes. And when the kids leave, they make an interesting comment that is kind of convoluted, and I think that's maybe potentially part of the purpose, is they mention that they might be able to return someday because it's already begun, implying that this new universe that they're starting might be the one that they belong in, and thus everyone will re-meet again in this new universe.
Yes.
Once it's been made.
Yeah. This movie, again, doesn't explain a lot, but it has a lot to it.
Yes.
And I think that's something that's so great about these Japanese cyberpunk films, is that they leave it open to interpretation. They put symbolism in there.
Sure.
And they try and get you to think about the world
And you don't necessarily need, for most Japanese cyberpunk, anyway, and especially not for Akira, you don't need an in-depth understanding of Japan and its history and its culture and its mannerisms, because even though the way you interpret it might not be the way that was originally planned or thought out, it's not wrong. It's not the wrong interpretation.
Yeah.
It's just an interpretation.
Yes.
Which, because Akira is arguably talking about all of the different possibilities and outcomes possible in all timelines, you could be right.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone could be right, which is part of the fun, I think.
And so, to wrap up our conversation about Akira, I really want to talk about the legacy this movie has made.
Ooh, buddy.
Oh yeah, we have briefly mentioned this, that how important this movie is. This movie, I think it was the 2013 trailer when it was released, it touted no Akira, no Matrix.
Oh, for sure.
Which Akira went on to inspire. Akira is the first Japanese cyberpunk manga. And it went to inspire series like Serial Experiment Lane, Cowboy Bebop, Ghost in the Shell, which all ended up influencing The Matrix. So
yep. And even not just The Matrix, but other things that we live with today, like The Dark Knight, the Kill Bill series, and
Stranger Things.
And then even video games that we've now become used to, like Metal Gear Solid.
My favorite, Final Fantasy VII. I mean, this movie's influences is...
It's incredibly wide-reaching, and...
Even Stranger Things, it was influenced by this movie.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that there doesn't seem necessarily to be a hard-lining end to where its influences start and stop, only because of the breadth that it covered and covered well.
And not only that, this movie was internationally successful.
Yes.
This was the first majorly successful anime in the world. Like,
not just in Japan, but like US, Britain, Australia, it went everywhere.
Yeah, and not only that, but I mean, it was arguably one of the first adult animation movies.
I would say, especially for the West, it was the first adult animation movie that wasn't adult in just its themes, but also in its visuals. In such a way that I don't think we had yet. And I think that has heavily influenced how the West is starting to still develop its understanding.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is this film is noted as setting up Japanese culture to what it is today in the U.S. It arguably set up the groundwork for shows like Naruto, Ghost in the Shell, all of those shows to be brought over here.
Oh, for sure.
Masashi Kishimoto stated that he was fascinated by the trailer, or not the trailer, the poster, and wanted to know how it was created in imitated style. That name sounds familiar because that's the writer and artist of Naruto.
Yes. And not only just in introducing Japanese themes to the West, but also introducing the idea that various types of media can be for adults.
Yeah. Well, and I don't even want to say Japanese themes, because the themes in Akira, I feel, are universal.
Oh, sure.
And that's why Japanese cyberpunk has done so well over here, is because it has the worldly influence to it. Like, when we watch Ghost in the Shell, we see signs in English, we see signs in Japanese, Chinese, we see them in India, or Hindu.
Yes.
And there's just this...
It's a good melting pot.
Yes.
That, because it is such a melting pot, you're not expected to understand all of the nuances that I think a lot of people struggle with when getting into this genre. Especially if you start with something maybe a little less Western friendly. Not necessarily a bad thing, but definitely intimidating to someone who's never even ventured into the world.
Yes.
Where Akira, it's kind of its own little thing. You don't even really need to read the book to appreciate the movie.
No.
Does it clarify some stuff? Sure, a little bit, but not to the point where it's needed.
But they're also separate entities, and you can watch and read and be fine with either one.
Oh, definitely.
And another thing about this is that, I mean, another little tidbit was that I learned is this was the first animated film in the Criterion Collection.
Ooh, fancy.
And it was the only one until 2014.
What was the second one?
Fantastic Mr. Fox.
I do like Fantastic Mr. Fox, despite the creepiness of it.
I have not seen it yet.
You would like it.
I do want to see it. I skipped it because I thought it was a kid's movie.
Nope, sure ain't.
So, I mean, I personally love this movie. I think it's fantastic. It's, regardless of your feelings towards cartoons.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, this movie, while definitely a genre-defining feature for anime and manga in general, I don't think is stuck in the box of anime.
No.
If that makes sense.
It is film.
Yeah, it could happily live outside of that genre just fine.
Mm-hmm. One thing I do want to say that I learned that's kind of sad, one of the key animators, Yoshiji Kagami?
Yes.
He died in the Kyoto Animation arson attack this year.
He did, which is really hard to hear, especially knowing that he had then gone on from Akira to devote his life to continuing to make beautiful animations.
And that was a huge thing too. Not only did it perpetuate the career of these people who honestly were no names at the time, Otomo, this completely changed his life. He stopped doing manga and moved specifically to animation. His I think his next major feature was Steam Boy, which was all computer done. Which
is another cool one if you haven't gotten around to it.
I mean, he's done all kinds of little shorts here and there, and it's just it's interesting to see how much this film changed.
Yes.
Not only animation, but the world's perception of Japanese animation. Disney was no longer the king. No. Studio Ghibli was on the rise.
And it also shaped the world of comics and music and film and games.
Yeah, the scene where Tetsuo is being scanned, that shows up in a Kanye West music video.
Yes, it does. I don't know if he understood it, but it sure does.
Yeah.
And so because this movie and entirety in its whole, really, not just the movie, but the works in general, managed to shake up the world so much. Even if you're not particularly into animation, I think this movie's worth a watch, because while it's not a lot of direct influences like some of the other movies we talked about, where it's quotes happening or direct scenes being reshot,
well,
this one you can very well see once you've watched it and start watching through other movies that you do enjoy. It starts to really show how things might have been influenced here and there.
Yeah. I mean, Spielberg even puts the motorbike in Ready Player One.
Yes.
So, I mean, we can go on and on about this. I mean,
This movie and its works are gigantic. It's almost never ending.
Yeah, and I mean, we'll probably see it continue to grow. Like,
I hope so, and I'm hoping that, especially with what I'm starting to see in the world of manga and anime, which is kind of a revisiting of the older classical works, especially since we grew up with them. We unfortunately were forced to grow up with them because that's what was in the library at the time. A lot of people younger than us had the privilege of being able to read whatever they wanted at the time.
Being able to go online and read it,
or being able to order things and brought to their house without a whole lot of fuss or trouble. And so I've seen in recent years a revisiting of not just the old style of drawing, but also the old style of storytelling. Especially with resurgence and things like Sailor Moon.
Yeah.
Which, similar time period.
Yeah. Sadly, I did learn that the live action for this has been canceled. I mean,
I get it.
I'm okay with it. I'm just a little sad because Waititi was supposed to direct it, and
they've teased a live action multiple times, and
well,
it would be a big undertaking.
Well, I mean, the other thing to talk about too is not only the influence on Western media, but the live action adaptations, because we saw Battle Angel Alita this year,
which I enjoyed, but the complaints I heard from it all, I think, I shouldn't say all, a lot of them stemmed from people who were not familiar with the story and some of the background information, which is heartbreaking because that's not how a movie should be.
No.
You shouldn't have to already know the story and the whys of why things are the way they are to appreciate them. But at the same time, I think it flopped because of that.
Yeah, and I felt... Because I'm not familiar with Battle Angel Alita. Or Alita Battle Angel. I watched it for the first time last night, and I felt parts of it were rushed. And me knowing live actions, I feel I can feel those a little bit better because they're
condensing something that was already condensed down.
Where like an episode is half an hour, you're condensing 24 of those, which arguably is like only 4 volumes of a series into a 2-hour film.
Or even another example that we saw, which arguably had more success, though I don't know how much more, would be we saw the live adaptation of Death Note recently. Oh god,
that was awful.
Yes and no. And that's kind of where I think the next great frontier for anime and manga is hopefully heading, because while these things are bad, like, example, we also got a live adaptation and a westernized adaptation of Ghost in the Shell.
Which...
I didn't hate it, but, like, I'm easygoing. So, I know a lot of people were not happy.
That's another thing to discuss.
That's a different movie. Yeah. For another time.
My 2 bits into that, I will say, the people who protested it and skipped the movie, you missed the entire point of the movie.
Oh, for sure.
There is a reason they cast a white woman as a traditionally Japanese character.
Yes, and those are just 3 examples, and 3 newer examples of the live adaptation world, which those of us who have been in the genre for a while remember some not as great live adaptations that came well before it, and so while these ones aren't great, they're passable. Which means hopefully in the next couple of years we get great ones.
Yeah, I will say, with Western live actions...
Western is the main hurdle.
I feel we are on the cusp. Like how we were talking about musicals.
Yes,
I would
we are
say
so close.
Pacific Rim is probably the closest thing we got to a giant mecha robot anime, and it was critically loved. And I saw that, and I'm like, this has the potential. Like,
it does.
We could do a Gundam movie, we could do a Neon Genesis Evangelion, and I think those could do very well. But we've also seen, like, the little creeping in of movies, like Edge of Tomorrow. I didn't realize that was based off a series called All You Need Is Kill. And that did pretty well in the U.S., but no one knew it was a manga series, and no one complained that they whitewashed it either.
Well, I think those 2 things went hand in hand. But I think that the anime and manga world, despite what potentially some of our parents feel still, I think it's becoming mainstream to the point where the live adaptations aren't just going under the radar as another innovative movie, but as a live adaptation on the big screen. And because of that, they're getting criticism in a way that hopefully helps them grow and understand why the original works were loved the way they were.
And we have the potential to see what happened like Marvel.
Yes.
I don't like superhero movies as much. I think they're overdone.
Sure.
But
I can see that.
There's always the potential to grow. There's so much diverse material out there. I know there's different character arcs. Like, I know there's a Peter Parker zombie arc, and that one's supposed to be one of the better ones.
There's a lot of different zombie arcs.
I'm speaking out of my ass. I don't know much about American comics, so.
But I think we are on the cusp of that. And while I'm sad to hear that this movie's not going to get its live adaptation, I think this one would be one of the more ambitious ones to attempt. And while I'm excited to see it, and I will definitely go once it comes, I don't think we're quite ready for it yet. And I'd rather hold off on this one to be perfect.
Yes, no, that is... And, it might not ever come to fruition. It might be one of those ones where it's better left not being turned into a live action.
And I could see that.
Yeah. So.
But what would you rate this one, Nico?
If you love sci-fi and you love have movies that make you think, and everything's not spoon-fed to you, this is a movie for you.
Oh, for sure.
I personally would say this is a movie for everyone, because not only was it an impactful and important movie to where we are in cinema now, I feel this movie still holds social context, as does a lot of these cyberpunk futuristic movies.
Sure. There's a lot of social and political themes that are still incredibly relevant in this movie. Potentially more so even than they were when it came out.
Yeah. So, what would you give this movie rating?
I grew up watching this movie. Mm-hmm. And then I grew up watching the things that this movie inspired.
Yeah.
And so if you, for some reason, have made it through your anime and manga journey, and you're in here deep with the rest of us, this is definitely worth a watch for you. If you are like my dear mother, this is one you can pass.
Yeah.
But it's one that you can pass, but I think it's one that wouldn't hurt having a little research behind. Mm-hmm. Only because of how many other movies that you probably have seen that it's influenced. Yes. Watch a couple clips from it so that you can understand what level of animation we're talking about here. Watch a couple of the fight scenes so you can see the level of clarity and detail.
The smoothness of the animation.
There is, and I firmly believe this, there's no other hand-drawn fight scenes that run as crisp and as smoothly as this movie.
Nope.
And so even if you don't watch this movie in its entirety, because I can see how this wouldn't be some people's taste. It is a lot to digest. It is on the verge of body horror for most people. It might be too much for some. However, I do recommend you try and watch a couple of the most recognizable scenes, because this one did change a lot of stuff in the world. And I don't know, if you're an adventurous movie watcher, it's definitely go. Definitely watch this movie. It's great. I watch it every couple years just to refresh myself.
Yep.
Just because I like it.
Only thing I'm really hoping for is the 2020 Tokyo Olympics pays some homage to this film.
That would be incredibly wonderful, but I could understand if they don't.
They announced it with Mario turning into the Prime Minister of Japan.
Yes, but that's because Mario and Godzilla are both they're a little bit more westernized than this one is, despite the impact this had. Yeah. So, would I say watch this? Definitely at least watch parts of it.
Yeah. Well, anywho, this has been The Good, the Bad, and the Weird.
Thanks for listening.
Peace and happy holidays. Be safe out there.